In the opening epigraph of Patrick Deneen's new book, Willa Cather writes, quote, "There are only 2 or 3 human stories, and they go on repeating themselves as fiercely as if they had never happened before. Like the larks in this country that have been singing the same 5 notes over for thousands of years," close quote. Patrick J. Deneen, on his captivating new book, American Odyssey, What an Ancient Story Reveals About Our Divided Souls, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Patrick J. Deneen is professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, where he has taught since 2012. He is the author or editor of 9 books and dozens of articles on a wide range of subjects. His best-selling 2018 book, Why Liberalism Failed, has been translated into over 20 languages and was recommended by former President Barack Obama. He taught previously at Princeton University and Georgetown University and served as special assistant and speechwriter for the director of the United States Information Agency from 2005 to 2007. His newest book, titled American Odyssey, What an Ancient Story Reveals About Our Divided Souls, was released on July 21st, 2026. Patrick, welcome.
Thanks, Todd, for having me. I appreciate it.
Segment 1. What is the Odyssey? In the preface of American Odyssey, Patrick Deneen writes, quote, "In writing this book, my goal is to help us understand ourselves better, here at the end of America's first quarter millennium and the beginning of its next, through an engagement with a book roughly 2,500 years older than the Declaration of Independence, and through an engagement with American works that have become as much a part of the American ethos as the Odyssey was for the ancient Greeks. For I believe there's no figure in all literature who prefigures the American dilemma, our divided soul, quite so prophetically and revealingly as does one of the oldest, one of the most variegated, one of the most Greek and yet Proto-American of the ancient heroes, Odysseus of Ithaca." Well, Patrick, I want to say once again, welcome to you and welcome back from Mars to anyone who hasn't quite heard of Homer's Odyssey, especially given that Christopher Nolan is making the movie. Matt Damon and Anne Hathaway have thrust it back into our consciousness with this summer blockbuster movie version. But I want to say something about what you said to me before we began here. And that is, in some ways, the movie and the rendition of the movie and the actors and the buzz surrounding the movie, in a way, can sort of eclipse the story itself. And so I want to begin with just some background for some people that may not be too familiar with this story and its author. Patrick, let's begin with, who was Homer and what is the Odyssey?
Well, this is beginning with, of course, the hardest question that can't be answered. Start with something easier.
Yeah.
Well, we don't know who Homer was. Of course, there's no historical record of Homer. And it's funny right now, my social media is blowing up with all of these people discovering theories that there have been longstanding scholarly debates over whether Homer is a composite of many different poets, whether it's kind of a gathering together of a lot of tales. I tend to be of the school of thought that thinks these poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are simply just so fantastically good and unified and driven by a kind of genius that these are the product of a human being who was drawing on a lot of traditions, but pulled together what were at this time a lot of basically stories that would be told by minstrels, by bards that would travel around the Mediterranean telling stories for their dinner. And that's the theory of where the origin a lot of these stories came from. And that if these stories were entertaining and they gripped people, that you might get a kind of gig for a couple of months, and they'd feed you and give you a place to sleep and take care of you. And that over time, these stories become solidified, they're gathered together. And then this figure, Homer, somewhere around 800 BC, pulls them together, whether it was one person named Homer, whether it was 2 different poets, pulls these stories together and creates 2 of the great epics and two of the great works of literature of the broadly of the Western tradition, certainly of the ancient world. So it's a hard question to answer because we simply don't know. As for the Odyssey is, of course, it's believed because it temporally follows. It's a sort of sequel to the Iliad. It takes place after the Trojan War, 20 years to be exact. It's believed that it was written at a later point, either later in Homer's life or by a later poet who we also call Homer. I think there's good reason to think that it's probably a later work. It draws on, and it in many ways it implicitly and at points maybe even explicitly appeals to aspects of the Iliad. It's also playing on the Iliad and in some ways contesting with the Iliad in the same way that I think Odysseus as a hero is contesting with Achilles as a hero, and these are being contrasted. And I talk about this in the book. What is the nature of heroism is, I think, one of the deep, profound questions that animates both of these great texts. But of course, it's a sequel in which one figure from the Trojan War, Odysseus, who's one of many of the Greek warriors, is attempting what might seem like a very simple thing. After the war ends, he wants to go home. And, today we sort of think someone getting on a plane and going home and just re-entering their life. Mm-hmm. But this is, of course, it's not that far in terms of distance from, Troy then and the coast of present-day Turkey to Greece. But in the kind of cosmic scheme of things, it's a world away. Of course, it's harder to travel over the sea at this time, but it's also I think a metaphor for the distance between a world of war and a world of death, destruction, pain, suffering, and agony, and a world that should be defined by civility and peace and a kind of being at home, what it is to be home, and I think any soldier who's experienced this knows these are, no matter how easy the actual journey may be, the real journey, in some ways, or I should say, the figurative journey is quite vast, and I think that this is one of those stories that captures that vastness.
You really highlight that notion of, effectively, you don't speak as much about the Iliad in this book, but the notion that, again, the Iliad is the call to arms, the heading to war, the and all the violence and the honor and the suffering that can come with it, and yet there is this sense of nostalgia and homesickness that comes with the Odyssey, which is, again, the long return from war, like you said, just going back home. I also wanted to say, this is from my own experience with Homer's epics and with Virgil's Aeneid and then the Greek tragedies. For those who haven't read a lot of these, one thing I'll say, and I'd ask you to correct me because you're more expert on this than I am, but the Iliad seems to be the centerpiece of, the Greeks going to fight the Trojans, Helen, Menelaus, the Greek, his wife is effectively seduced or runs away with Paris, the Trojan. She's the face that launched 1,000 ships. The Greeks they basically fight for 10 years against the Trojans in the city of Troy, ultimately defeating them with the Trojan horse and so on. And then from that point, from the Iliad, we have the spin-off. So I like to say, for anybody who's old enough to understand this parallel, the Iliad is Happy Days, and Odysseus, or the Odyssey, is a little bit like Laverne and Shirley,
right?
And the Aeneid is Joni Loves Chachi,
or Mork.
Exactly. I should say exactly. Mork and Mindy, which was just. I hate to even kind of reduce Virgil and Homer to anything that's Mork and Mindy or Joni Loves Chachi. But that out of the Iliad, out of that narrative, Aeneas, the Trojan, leaves, and the story of him founding Rome and the wild adventure he goes on in the Aeneid. But then Odysseus on the Greek side leaves Troy, the Trojan War, and he's going back to arrive at home. And also, interestingly, the Oresteia, which is the trilogy of Agamemnon, the libation bearers, and the Eumenides, has Agamemnon returning the leader of the Greeks, returning to home in the very, for after 10 years of war to his wife Clytemnestra, and getting slain by her. And so you see out of the Iliad, you see these incredible tragedies or epics emerge. Yes. Would you say anything about some of the unity of those things and why that matters?
Yeah, so I mean, it's actually believed that there were many, many epics that were written out of this, out of the Iliad, and we have two of these. Who knows what great masterpieces never got transmitted into
Yeah.
from deep antiquity to modernity. It would be one of those great discoveries, one to be wished for, to discover some of these. But it's doubtless that we have two of the greatest of these with the Iliad and the Odyssey. With that said, it's interesting. The Odyssey begins not to talk about when it begins. The very first lines of the Odyssey begin with Zeus in a kind of assembly of the gods on Olympus, Zeus complaining about how the mortals blame the gods for everything, and specifically refers to the murder of Agamemnon by his wife, his unfaithful wife, Clytemnestra, upon his return home. He's taking a bath, imagine, like, oh, I'm home, fine, I can get a nice bath. He's in the bathtub, and she slays him in the bathtub.
Yeah.
And she's been having an affair with, being adulterous relationship with Aegisthus, who is then, he and Clytemnestra are both murdered then by their son Orestes, who then, of course, famously goes on in Aeschylus's trilogy, as you mentioned, to become the centerpiece. That the revenge against his mother, becomes the centerpiece. Really, I think, and I talk about this toward the end of the book. What I think the Odyssey begins by setting up is that the war doesn't end in Troy. The war affects everything. And again, I think any soldier, in a sense, knows this, returning home. You take the war home with you, or the war, this disturbance of, now, of course, in the Iliad, it's a disturbance of cosmic dimensions. The gods are as much at war as the humans are. And it's not simply contained to the battlefield. It spills out everywhere into the lives and into the relationships and the marriages and the families of everyone who's involved in this war. And so at the very beginning of the epic, not only do we hear about Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, we also then hear immediately about what's happening in Ithaca, in Odysseus's home island, and how, in a way, this kind of the aftermath of the Trojan War is playing itself out on the island home of Odysseus, where there has not been peace and comity and harmony for at least 10 years, especially as it's now believed that Odysseus has been lost at sea, killed, died somewhere. And of course, famously, the suitors, the young men who are now trying to take the place of Odysseus to become the king of Ithaca through marriage to Penelope, have been now like locusts on the land, eating up all of the goods, the stores, the treasures of Odysseus in his palace on Ithaca. So the war has these tremendous repercussions. And the big question of the Odyssey, as for many of these texts, the Oresteia is another good one. How do you end the chain of retribution?
Yeah.
How does the murder of this person, right? How does the abduction of Helen, how is that avenged? Well, the destruction of an entire city. How is that then avenged? Well, as we know from events in our own day, right? The Middle East is one big story of this, right? You did this, I'm going to do this. How does one end what seems to be the endless cycle of retribution that can never be finished, never can be concluded? Now, as Christians, we have an answer to this.
Exactly.
Right. Our answer to this, of course, ultimately is there has to be forgiveness, and there has to be a kind of reconciliation. The ancient world didn't have this, right? You engage in revenge until you're dead or they're dead.
Yeah.
And the Odyssey is really kind of the effort to say it may just take a kind of fiat of the gods to end this, because there's no other way out. And so it's a deep reflection on this basic element of human beings, that war unleashes these forces that humans then can't contain. It's very difficult for us to contain.
For those who are also interested, after you read Patrick's terrific book and you read the Odyssey, going to the Oresteia, looking for some sort of a way out of this cycle of vengeance and blood violence, blood against blood and so on. In the third book of the Oresteia, the Eumenides is where, effectively, if I remember correctly, the trial set up by Athena trying Orestes for murdering his own mother and avenging his own father, and the Furies want to destroy. The Furies pursue, injustice that is not
Orestes,
slaked.
Yeah.
And
This is vengeance. Yeah.
yeah, and if I remember correctly, Athena effectively provides a certain acquittal for Orestes, but in a sense, kind of assuages the fury of the Furies by effectively dubbing them the Eumenides, the kindly ones, and giving them certain perks and all that kind of stuff. But to your point, I mean, it's a Girardian, like a Rene Girardian kind of a notion to some of this. There's the scapegoat, there's the mimetic rivalry, there's the catharsis of kind of taking out the bad person, and then the cycle kind of begins again. And to your point, where does this all end? Where is there a reconciliation? And like you said, for Catholics, it's like, well, Christ on the cross is the ultimate version of the reconciliation.
Yes.
Patrick, I want to ask you, early in the introduction to your book, American Odyssey, you explain the relevance of Homer's ancient classic to modern America. And you illustrate it through observations of the 19th century Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville. And in his exquisite work, Democracy in America, Tocqueville wrote, quote, "It is odd to watch with what feverish ardor the Americans pursue prosperity, and how they are ever tormented by the shadowy suspicion that they may not have chosen the shortest route to get it. An American will build a house in which to pass his old age and sell it before the roof is on. He will plant a garden and rent it just as others reap the harvest. He will take up a profession and leave it, settle in one place, and soon go off elsewhere with changing desires. Death steps in the end and stops him before he has grown tired of this futile pursuit of that complete felicity which always escapes him," close quote. So Tocqueville puts his finger on a distinctly American restlessness and inquiet, even as you describe it, a civilizational discontentment. So I want to ask you, what good and what bad did Tocqueville believe came from this peculiar form of American agitation? And then how did this compare with the more static, if you would say, contented approach of his European contemporaries?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most famous chapters of Tocqueville's Democracy in America, in which he talks about restlessness or inquietude, the inability to be still.
Yes.
In the second volume of Democracy in America, and I think it's always a very arresting chapter, and even that passage you just read, because it doesn't sound like it was written in the 1830s.
No,
it sounds like it could have been written today.
Exactly.
Whenever I read that, I always joke with my students. I said, well, this, he's just basically pitching a show called Flip That House. It's basically, like he said, before the roof is even on, people are looking to sell the house. It's this captures, I think, a deep-seated aspect of our American psyche. And for him, it's the water we swim in, and so we tend not to notice it. Maybe it's just kind of our norm. But for Tocqueville, this is stunning because as you just indicated, as compared to aristocratic France, life is not driven by this sense of restlessness, precisely because your status and your station in the world is defined by your birthright. Who you're born to, where you're born, what your parents' profession are. I always like to point out to students how many last names, either indicated one's profession, like Smith and Weaver and Cooper and Wright, or who or where one was from, such as de Tocqueville, who's from the estate and from the family of de Tocqueville, right? The D.E. I always like to say I'm obviously a French aristocrat with a name like Deneen of the famous House of Neen. But Tocqueville comes to a world in which your station and your status are not given. They are entirely, maybe not entirely, but significantly the result of your own efforts. And this means that you can never rest on your laurels. You can never simply say, I did it. I achieved the brass ring. I finished the race of life. That one is always kind of in this constant kind of quasi-competition. Maybe this gets back to mimesis, this kind of constant comparison, but also urge to push oneself forward because one defines one's own future and even one's own self, it's believed. So this quality of Americans, this restlessness, is on the one hand, we could say, Tocqueville's amazed by it and in some ways impressed by it. He says this leads, of course, to a kind of ambition. It leads to the desire for greatness. It makes America a dynamic society in a way that his France was not, aristocratic France was not. But it has costs, like anything. And those costs are anxiety, a sense of constant gnawing uncertainty about whether one has made the right choices, whether those choices are going to lead to a whole set of better choices. And as you quoted, it leads to discontent, a kind of institutionalized discontent. We can never sort of say, when Jefferson coined the phrase, or actually borrowed the phrase from John Locke, the pursuit of happiness, that captures something because, of course, for the ancients, happiness is the goal. That's the telos of human beings, is to attain the condition of flourishing, of happiness, of eudaimonia in the Aristotelian sense. It's to be happy. But in America, we're given the right to pursue happiness. And I think that idea of pursuit means that in some ways it's always a kind of receding goal. It's always just lying just out of reach. It's a little bit like the Sisyphean getting the rock over the top of that hill. So I think Tocqueville understood both the great promise and consequences of this restlessness, as well as its sources, but also its profound costs.
So Patrick, then, how, according to Tocqueville, was this inveterate American restlessness paradoxically countered by the devotion to the permanent things of home and township? That is kind of a rootedness, a durability, a penchant to memorialize. So you talk about it's sort of like this ironic kind of contradiction, restlessness that's countered by, again, the devotion to permanence. Is that capacity to live with kind of unresolvable opposites, is that particularly American, just as you described the difference between aristocratic France and kind of the up-and-coming American? Or is that more, to your way of thinking, a manifestation of the human condition, but it's just made explicit in the American enterprise?
Yeah. Yeah, of course, this goes to the heart of the subtitle of my book, what this ancient story reveals about America's divided soul. And this is really the whole narrative is, of course, it rests on this divided soul rests on the division of the human soul. Or you could say there's what I describe as distinctively or maybe intensely American forms of division is a division that's not unique to Americans. It is endemic to our human condition. Right. But as is often the case, aspects of our nature are often amplified in America. In some ways, when George Bishop Berkeley said that westward the course of empire goes, you could say westward the course of human nature goes. That a kind of intensification of the human experience was made especially manifest in this new world, where our endemic possibility, the possibility or prospect of restlessness, which of course Augustine describes in the opening of the Confessions, and which has always been a part of our great literary philosophic tradition, going all the way back to the Odyssey, if nothing else. At the same time, it's manifest in a very intense form because this is a place without an aristocratic past, and it's a place where we literally think of ourselves as frontiersmen and pioneers, as everything is in a sense open to us. And even after 1893 and Frederick Jackson Turner declares the frontier is closed, we still are frontiers people. We still want to find the next frontier, the new frontier. This is still part of our language. Elon Musk wanting to go off to Mars. It's a part of our psyche. And so I'm not making a claim, and I want to be clear to listeners who might be from other countries or who hate the idea of American exceptionalism. I'm not making the case that this is only an American phenomenon, but I do think there's a case to be made that you can see some of these aspects of human nature with particular intensity in the American frame, that given certain features of American life, it makes those rather intensified. And I think that intensification is really captured in so much of our literature and so much of our film. And that was really the effort in this book, was to say, hey, look, this very old ancient text describes this aspect of our nature that we, in many ways, is an embodiment of our own self-understanding. And we just have to kind of raise it to the surface of visibility for us to say, oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, Wizard of Oz, the Odyssey. Yeah, I get it.
Patrick, in American Odyssey, you write, quote, "In the Odyssey, contemporary readers and viewers of cinematic versions see not an antiquated Bronze Age story populated by unrecognizable pre-modern humans, but a familiar version of themselves, even if one that is more stylized, elemental, and poetic. The story portrays three highly familiar American themes: the restlessness of the adventurer, the longing for home, and the recognition that even when you finally return to your point of origin, you inevitably discover that, quote, you can't go home again, close quote, at least not to the identical home you left behind, close quote. So, Patrick, give us a little bit of the story of how you personally first discovered the commonality between the Odyssey and the American story. And then secondly, just reflect, if you don't mind, on your sense of how great literature like Homer, Virgil, Dante, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, Austen, you name it, how they tell more than a story, but in fact, quite a lot about ourselves and the human condition. So let's begin with you and the Odyssey and you're making this kind of this parallel connection, and then why you think literature speaks so loudly to what it means to be human.
Hmm. Well, it probably won't surprise you, Todd, having read my book, that I have been thinking about the Odyssey for a long time.
Yep.
I think there are certain people, or let me put it this way. If you love books, if you're a reader, there's usually, lying back there's usually one or several books that were deeply formative. Mm-hmm. And why it is that you become a lover of books. It's I think, maybe there are some people who love books and then they read books and they discover which books they love, but I think it probably goes in the other direction. There's a certain, maybe one text or set of text that maybe as a young person you read, which set you on a course of, I'm going to mine these works. Mm-hmm. I'm going to keep reading. I want to understand. So for me, that was the Odyssey. I think I was in middle school when I read it. I think it was maybe freshman year of high school. I can't remember exactly. And I remember I was absolutely enraptured. And my classmates were kind of, not throwing shade on them, but they were kind of like, oh, this is kind of boring. And I was like, this is incredible. This is such a great story. I loved it. But I think I immediately identified with it because I came from a small town in Connecticut, Windsor, Connecticut, which is a lovely New England town. It's kind of like the town that Tocqueville describes, or the kind of town Tocqueville describes as the place where Americans make their homes, the New England township. Yeah. And I loved aspects of my town, and I have a great deal of nostalgia for the town I grew up in. But I was also a young teenager and longing to go out and see the world. I really wanted to go abroad. I wanted to see foreign lands. I'm like George Bailey. I wanted to get out and explore all the wonders of the world. And I read in that book, I think at the moment of my life that I read it, it was for me the crystallization that I wanted these two things that it's very tough to put together. It's not impossible, but it's tough to put together this sense of being at home and being deeply attached to your place, and this kind of deep longing and desire to get out, to go somewhere else, to get out of Dodge, to be the pioneer, to be the explorer, to go west. And I guess for me, from the very start, I immediately just began to see how much this was a theme, not just for me, but how much this was a theme in the American experience. That we were, for anyone whose ancestors, they themselves personally came from a European or some, kind of other foreign destination, America was a place that drew people who simultaneously wanted to get out. In my case, it was the Irish from Cork who came over here that wanted to go somewhere new, to find a new life, to make a new life, to engage in new possibilities, but also to make a home, to go somewhere where they could now settle, plant roots, and become now Americans, become people who were settled. So we're pioneers and we're settlers. And this ambivalence that I think is very easily recognizable to Americans is also, I think, there in the Odyssey. I think it's one of the animating, there are a lot of themes in the Odyssey. We could spend, years just discussing, the relationship of humans and gods and the question of justice. And there's just manifold number of themes, but this particular theme of the longing to go out, the desire, the craving to know, to encounter the unusual, the new, the distinctive, the unknown, and the desire to go home are both simultaneously deeply at play in that work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's incredible.
Mm.
I wanted to also, by the way, when you mentioned that you read the Odyssey in middle school, that just makes my heart soar like a hawk. I think of Dylan's 2016, Bob Dylan's Nobel Prize speech for literature, when he talks about that it wasn't just, studying folk and listening to folk music. It was reading the Odyssey, it was reading Moby Dick, it was reading All Quiet in the Western Front, and that these things sank into his marrow. As a matter of fact, I don't know if he begins, but he definitely ends his speech with a quote from the Odyssey. So just the notion of what is, and this is a total another podcast we'll have to talk about, but all these kind of hand-reading articles out there about how can we ask college kids to read a book? They can't do it. It's just asking too much. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, you're reading this and falling in love with this as a grammar school or middle school.
I
mind you, not everybody who's from Windsor, Connecticut, ended up being a professor of political science in Notre Dame. But that being said, it grabs somebody and it can transform their life. So that's an amazing, amazing story. And I love that. Patrick, I'm bringing you back for another talk on that for sure, because I want to probe your mind on that. Patrick, your sense of a melancholic, incomplete feeling upon returning home reminds me of Hilaire Belloc's words from The Four Men. He says, quote, "This is a story about a man who basically journeys with three others just to go back. He's an Englishman who's going to go back to, I think, Sussex, find his way back home, and all the stories they tell and the songs they sing and the people they meet and the mild adventures they have, but also the landscapes of merry England at the time." This is written in 1902. It's done over the course of 4 days, like around Halloween and All Hallows Eve and All Souls Day. Anyway, he ends the book saying, upon arriving at home, he says, quote, "For my part, I've traveled widely." Oh, forgive me, this is Grizzlebeard saying this earlier in the book, but he says, "For my part, I've traveled widely, altogether 40 times. I've come back to the flats of my own country. Then, indeed, I have each time remembered my boyhood, and each time I've been glad to come home, but I have never found it to be a final gladness. After a time, I must be off again and find new places," close quote. And then there's G.K. Chesterton's epiphany when he says, quote, "The modern philosopher has told me again and again that I was in the right place, and I had still felt depressed even in acquiescence, but I had heard that I was in the wrong place, and my song sang for joy like a bird in spring. The knowledge found out and illuminated forgotten chambers in the dark house of infancy. I knew now why I could feel homesick at home."
Well, sure.
Now, this may be a softball question.
As I was revisiting the Odyssey and thinking about these themes,
as a Catholic, is this homesickness for home a certain testimony of our restless heart, of our yearning for God? What's your sense about that?
You could say that one of the things that the Odyssey captures. So the word for homecoming in Greek is nostos, and this is described as the goal. This is the object of Odysseus's journey, like this long 10-year journey home. What is its purpose and its aim? It is nostos. It is homecoming, and this is the origin, or at least a component, of the word nostalgia. It's one of the two words that's combined. The other word is algos in Greek, which means a kind of absence or a lack, a kind of sense of emptiness, something that's missing. So if you put these two words together, you get, of course, nostalgia, which is that sense of longing or absence when you are not at home. This was a modern coinage. This word was not coined by the ancient Greeks. The two words are Greek, but they weren't put together by the Greeks. They were put together in the 19th century to describe a more modern condition, you could say. And I think, and I say this in the book, I think many of us at least can recognize, and I think it's reflected in that quote you just mentioned by Chesterton, we can feel a sense of nostalgia even when we're at home, because being at home is always, I would say, we are aware of how being at home lacks something that would, in some final sense, make us feel truly, finally, completely being at home. If by that we mean knowing we're in the right place, knowing that, this is where I'm meant to be. This is where my heart is satisfied, where my longings are able to rest, where I'm restless in that Tocquevillian sense. And we're not going to find that in this life. That's not going to be a possibility. And this is why, of course, Augustine writes, my heart is restless until it rests in you, Lord. That we have no choice in a way. It's part of our nature to be longing for some final home that we will never achieve in this life, but which we can have a taste of, which we can experience. And therefore we have an understanding of what that sense of nostos is. So I think we're simultaneously creatures, again, who are creatures of nostos and creatures of algos. And even at home, we can feel a kind of nostalgia for a home that we long for. Again, as Christians, we have a vocabulary for this that the Greeks didn't have. But one of the themes that I talk about, and we might be talking about this soon, but one of the last chapters of the book talks about how ambivalent it can be to make one's homecoming. That when you finally reach the goal, so we can imagine when Odysseus finally gets home after this 20 years of being away, 10 years on this journey home. I don't know how Nolan's movie ends. This is the day before its release we're talking. But, there's a kind of sense at the end of the Odyssey of like the fade out from a Hollywood movie. It's like, and they lived happily ever after. Odysseus gets, defeats the suitors and he and Penelope are reunited. And it seems like, okay, that's the happy ending. But we all know once you achieve the happy ending, what's next? And a lot of authors who've written then kind of their own sequels to the Odyssey basically portray Odysseus as kind of like, it's not as great as I thought it was. And it's kind of boring here. And life on the sea was really exciting. And so there's all these sequels that are written of the Odyssey, which Odysseus like stays around for, maybe a week, maybe a year. In the case of Nikos Kazantzakis for one day, and then gets back onto a ship and goes out again. So that tension of finding home, being at home, and then longing for some true home, I think is certainly something as Christians we both understand, but also we understand that the true home lies ultimately not in whatever home we happen to be in right now. It rests, with God.
Segment 2, Lessons from Beasts and Gods. In American Odyssey, Patrick Deneen writes, quote, self-sufficiency, immediate knowledge, obliviousness. The Odyssey reminds us that these are the special characteristics of gods and beasts. Humans lack each of these characteristics. They are beyond human attainment. Yet to reach for them is a perennial temptation. The Odyssey emphasizes the challenge of remaining human in a world that tempts us to believe that it just might be possible to achieve what seems a far better non-human state. The difficulty of Odysseus' journey homeward lies not so much in the challenge of negotiating passage past and through a panoply of dangerous beasts and gods, as it does in the challenge of resisting the temptation to trade his humanity for the condition of another kind of being. In this resistance, Odysseus is generally steadfast. Typically, it is he who rescues his men from their propensity towards beastliness, close quote. So, Patrick, this fascinates me. I've been talking about this with friends over the last 2 weeks, over and over again, self-sufficiency, immediate knowledge, obliviousness. Could you elaborate on the temptation for human beings to become either gods or beasts through the temptation for self-sufficiency, immediate knowledge, and obliviousness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very difficult for me to read the Odyssey. We've been mentioning its Christian resonances, but it's also very difficult for me to read the Odyssey without Aristotelian resonances. And as I discuss at the opening of the early chapter of the book, in many ways, I think Aristotle is one of the great readers of, and he's very interested in, as any Greek would have been, very interested in the kind of philosophical lessons of both the Iliad and the Odyssey. When Aristotle begins his Politics, he begins it by understanding, of course, that to talk about politics means you have to talk about human nature. Right? We can't begin to think about what kind of politics we have to live in, what kind of regime, what kind of government, right, we should have, unless we get a firm or at least as good a hold on what human nature is as possible. And where does Aristotle turn as he begins to think about that? He turns to Homer. and he turns to a couple passages in the Iliad, and then particularly to Polyphemus, to the Cyclops, as a kind of example of that which is not human, right? That which is deficiently human. And it turns out that which is deficiently human is are all three of those things you just described, right? The belief in self-sufficiency, and a kind of direct knowledge of things, and obliviousness. Polyphemus is a really interesting figure. Of course, I'm sure he's going to be portrayed as quite a stunning beast in the Nolan movie. The Cyclops, of course, famously devours Odysseus's men. Kills, bashes their head against the side of the cave wall, and then devours them raw. And he's a very beastly character. But it also turns out he's also the son of Poseidon, so he's a god. He's simultaneously these two things that Aristotle will determine, okay, to be a human is to be neither a beast nor a god, right? It's to be neither something as vicious as kind of, potentially wild and beastly and ravenous as the Cyclops is. So our beastly nature is something we have to ascend above, but it's also not to be a god, because the gods are able to live in this condition of. So the word for one of the words for God is athanos, to be not dying, and we are creatures that die. We're creatures of limitations. We're creatures in which the world is uncertain, right? And so the gods, especially, are able to discern things that humans can't. They know things. They can recognize each other. They have immediate knowledge of things. So humans occupy this middle space between the beasts and the gods, and it's hard. It turns out it's hard for humans to occupy that space. You would think, okay, that's what it is to be human, but we're constantly being tempted, and there's constant it's part of our nature to resist our own nature, you could say, and Aristotle recognizes this. And so the challenge for human beings is to learn what that zone is, what that range is between, being less than human in our beastliness and more than human in our efforts to become a god. And it turns out it's difficult for humans to attain that middle position. And this is so Aristotelian, for whom, of course, famously, the virtues are the mean between extremes. And it's difficult for us to know how to act in a way that's courageous without being cowardly or foolhardy. So you got to find that middle range. And it turns out that middle range is what it is to be human for Aristotle. And I think he gains this insight in significant part through his encounter with the Odyssey, or at least that's how he's able to describe it, because so much of the journey of Odysseus and his men is that effort to live in that zone between the beastly and the gods. And there are temptations. You could almost say that every episode, every encounter of Odysseus, you can see how the temptation moves toward one or the other of these two, of being something less than or more than human. And Odysseus, not perfectly, but pretty solidly, is able to resist both of those temptations.
And tell me if I had this right, Patrick, because I felt that as you were writing this, not that any one beast or any one god embodied just one of those temptations. It was a mixed bag, but my sense was that Polyphemus, the Cyclops, he kind of embodied the self-sufficiency of the beasts. This kind of, I had forgotten how much the Cyclops sort of operated with his own little brood. Did not, when things were going badly for him or there was a lot of noise, the other Cyclops just went into their own caves and didn't kind of come out and help him out. Whereas the sirens, the beautiful sirens that are singing their music that tempt the sailors, just draw them towards their rocky shoals, and they ultimately shipwreck, and I don't know if they're devoured or what have you. They may represent kind of that. I know it can maybe morph based on the person that they're singing to and so on, but in Odysseus's case, it was the immediate knowledge. It was fleeing from the uncertain. It was being saved from doubt, if you will. Whereas the Lotus Eaters, it was a matter of just sort of this hazy, drugged obliviousness that you could just kind of find peace and release and let go and so on and so forth. First of all, am I correct in identifying each of those particular temptations with each of those particular beasts/gods? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, I think you're right that I draw out these three aspects of the beasts and the gods and then provide sort of different examples. So, yeah,
Yeah,
I'm not suggesting you find them thoroughly articulated or expressed in each of these creatures. I do
sure.
think that the gods, in a way, the gods do represent all three often.
Yeah, yeah,
That they're pretty self-sufficient. They are governed by Zeus, but if you know your Greek mythology, he's not. He
yeah,
doesn't really have a tight rein over things. Like
yeah.
Poseidon just goes off and does whatever he wants to do. It's a pretty strong court that he has, you could say. But the gods are especially noteworthy in their ability to know things. And
Yeah.
I do talk about this one episode just before Odysseus encounters Circe. He's stopped by Hermes, and so of course Circe famously is the enchantress who turns Odysseus's men into swine, and Odysseus is going to try to save them and likely will be turned into a swine himself. But Hermes stops him and says, "Here, take this potion. Here's a plant that I'm going to give you. This will make you immune from her magic, and it's called moly. And you don't know. It's hard for humans to find it, and it's hard for them to notice its properties. But I know its nature, and the word that's used there in the Greek is phusis. I know it's phusis. I can see. It's like almost I know its scientific composition in a way that you can't know because you can only know the surface of things. It's this great moment. It's the only time that the word phusis is used in all of Homeric literature. And so it's a very interesting moment that one of the qualities of the gods it's disclosed is that they can know the nature of things. And this also is why when gods encounter each other, even when they're in disguise, they know who they're dealing with. Whereas humans are constantly wondering, like Odysseus is constantly wondering, am I dealing with a god? Am I dealing with a
Yeah,
human?
yeah,
Are you what
yeah.
you appear to be? Disguises are very important in the Odyssey. So the human condition is one of deep uncertainty. And this quality of the gods also then leads to a kind of obliviousness that they don't have to suffer the costs of things in the same way that humans do. Our condition of uncertainty means we have to make choices and live with the costs without knowing in advance what those are going to be, and maybe not even knowing while we're in the midst of them. Right? We're in this constant haze of uncertainty, and then bearing the costs of that uncertainty. And so this is the human condition. You can see why it's tempting for us.
Yeah.
Why it is, for example, that Odysseus's men just want to stay with the lotus eaters, right? And that's a great metaphor for so much of modern life. We just
Yeah.
want a life of pleasurable distraction,
Yeah.
right? And it literally today, like you just get marijuana or whatever your drug of choice is, and you can literally, through pharmaceuticals, just kind of live this life of sort of oblivious, painless, floating above it all. And his men don't want to go. And he says he has to literally drag them out and away from the lotus eaters. Now, why does Odysseus do this? Why not just stay there? Life would be a lot easier.
Yeah.
He leaves the lotus eaters, one of the first stops, and things get really bad
Yeah.
from this
Yeah.
point forward. All of his men could have survived. He could have lived a kind of nice, pharmaceutically enriched life. And why not? And I think this is the interesting question throughout the Odyssey. Why not? Why doesn't he just stay with the lotus eaters? Why doesn't he stay on the island of the Phaeacians and marry Nausicaa, lovely young woman? Why doesn't he stay on Calypso's island and just be immortal? So there are all these points in which Odysseus has these choices to make of whether he's going to be a beast, like a lotus eater, or a god, like becoming an immortal with Calypso. And he negotiates his passage home. I think to understand the Odyssey, it's a metaphorical passage, not just to Ithaca, but through the temptations to be less or more than human. And what's the course you have to take to remain human?
See, this is one of the most important parts of this entire book, I think, and that is, I was with you saying, there's this why not, and again, you articulated it very well. Why not pursue self-sufficiency? Well, it could isolate. It could take away the solidarity that we do enjoy as part of being human beings, loving our families, camaraderie with our friends, and so on. Why not pursue immediate knowledge? That's a lot of anxiety gone because we don't have uncertainty, we don't have doubts, and so on. Well, because part of our life is wonder. and pursuing that which is glorious, even in the midst of some of the darkness of not knowing. Why not live in obliviousness? Well, because it kind of runs the risk of ultimately apathy and not arriving through the dark channels to the greater aspect of self. In one of your previous books, one of the riveting points that stuck with me again and again and again was the notion of a pre-modern definition of liberty and the modern definition. And the pre-modern is the hard level, if, as I recall correctly, and you wrote it, so you could correct me otherwise. But the notion of it is self-discipline, sacrifice, and hard work to arrive at a freedom to be virtuous. And yet virtuous is where we're destined to be. It's where happiness is. Whereas modern liberty in many respects is simply license. If it feels good, do it. And so to my way of thinking, there is a dovetailing of the point you made in the previous book in this choice that Odysseus is making and the temptation to say, let's go towards that which will make everything easier, but I will be deformed in the process. You know?
Yeah, I think that's a key point. So first of all, yes, this is of course should be obvious that probably by this point that the way in which the Odyssey had such a deep, profound influence on me as a young person has definitely been a part of shaping so much of my worldview as I became, older, read more books, encountered Aristotle, encountered the great authors in the Catholic tradition, the great theologians, the Bible itself, of course. And this all, of course, now in my mind is this large set of teachings about, especially the ancient idea and the Christian idea of liberty. And I think Odysseus is far from a perfect exemplar of this, but I think it is the beginnings in our own tradition of articulating how difficult it can be to be a human being. Again, not to bash John Locke and sort of liberalism, but okay, I'll take 30 seconds to do that. But it seems to me one of the problems that modern philosophy introduces is that we can discover human nature simply by imagining ourselves in a state of nature. That our nature can be understood if we strip away all of the extraneous accidents of our existence, and then we'll see what our nature is. That's why you create this state of nature scenario. Then we know what real human beings are. And according to this more ancient teaching, our human nature, it's hard. It's hard work. Yeah. It's something that in many ways, of course, it's given, but it's given in the same way that, Joe DiMaggio, in theory, was a great baseball player. That was given. Yeah. But there was a lot that had to be developed. There was a lot of practice. There was a lot of exercise. You have to do a lot to become Joe DiMaggio. It's not just state of nature, you're Joe DiMaggio. So this aspect of what it is to be a human, I think, gets diminished to the point of invisibility in modern philosophy. And this is why, again, an encounter with these great classical texts, and maybe not everyone's really interested in reading Aristotle, but you can pick up a great yarn like the Odyssey and you can see it sort of, in its sort of most primeval form, the kind of philosophy he's articulating. And the great example is kind of the dramatization of the struggle of what it is to achieve our humanity, which I think that's so much of what the Odyssey is about.
I want to start and move next to the Wizard of Oz. What you do in covering the Odyssey, and you open us up with Tocqueville's, insights and so on American character, the tension between a restlessness and the hunger for permanence and home and so on. You also kind of highlight several works, Huck Finn, Wizard of Oz, It's a Wonderful Life, Field of Dreams. I want to ask you. So L. Frank Baum's classic, The Wizard of Oz. You see it as a sort of American Odyssey. So could you tell us, again, why, and then specifically the tension between Dorothy's refrains of somewhere over the rainbow countered by there's no place like home?
Yeah. So, I mentioned how much reading the Odyssey as a young man had shaped how I kind of came to understand, of course, my own life living in a small town and yearning for more. And then how much of this I saw as I grew older and began to not just consume our cultural products, but began to sort of analyze them. Or, my wife always says that it's terrible going to a movie with me because I can't just watch it. I have to analyze it, and which I think that would be fun, but gives us something to talk about afterwards. But the brain doesn't turn off.
Roger
in the
Ebert's
movie theater.
reincarnated.
No. But that so much of then what I saw in especially the American literary and film tradition, which growing up, it's just you would Wizard of Oz would come on at least once a year on a network, and you'd watch it. And part of the reason I said it's America's Odyssey is partly because it shapes a kind of background self-understanding for many contemporary Americans, certainly of maybe our age, if I may, for whom this was something you would see every year. It was one of the cultural products that shaped, from a very young age. You'd watch it as a child. It was one of the things that we all watched. Everyone, and even to this day, like in Field of Dreams, if you know the movie, when one of the baseball players is going back into the corn field, he says, "I'm melting." So we all know what he means. We all know where that comes from. It's part of our cultural vocabulary, and it's in this sense. So in this sense, it's our Odyssey in the sense that every Greek child knew the stories from the Odyssey. It formed their background kind of belief system and self-understanding. They could all throw out a quote from it and people would know what they were talking about. But I also mean it forms our Odyssey because I think this film captures the same kind of dynamic that we've been discussing in the Odyssey. Odysseus is, even though Odysseus is, he wants to go home. It's reputed that he didn't really want to go. He didn't want to go to the Trojan War. There's legends and myths of him trying to get out of military service. He didn't want to go. But once he's on the journey home, he's pretty resolute about wanting to go home, but he also constantly wants to encounter things. And he's, as we've already mentioned, he's constantly tempted by the possibilities of encountering these things. We mentioned the episode with the sirens. It's a very key episode because Circe warns him before he encounters the siren. Look, there's going to be this one obstacle. You're going to encounter a number of obstacles. One of them is going to be the island of the sirens. They sing a song that tempts men to throw themselves off of their ship, and they in their desire to listen to their song, they are then crushed on the side of the island against the rocks. And there's a heap of bones, she describes, on the shore of the island of the sirens. So no man apparently can resist these songs. They are so beautiful or tempting that men lose their minds. They forget how deadly this is, and they throw themselves overboard. And she says, so what you need to do is everyone needs to stop up their ears, melt some wax and stop up your ears. But if you, Odysseus, want to listen to their song, you could have the men bind you to the mast, tie you really tight, and then when you cry out to be let out, they should tighten the bonds even more because you might get free. You might be so maddened by this music, by this song, that you'll pull yourself off of that mast and throw yourself overboard. So what does Odysseus do? He doesn't choose the wax option. He chooses the bind me to the mast option because he wants to know. Yeah. And he tempts then, he's basically tempting his own death by listening to this song. And he does. He tries to pull himself out. He tells his men to loosen him. They tighten the bonds, and he's able to listen to this song, which it turns out their song is the knowledge of all things that happen on, below, and above the earth. It's that divine knowledge of all things. It's the temptation of the knowledge of good and evil, maybe we could say.
Exactly.
Very archetypal.
Yes.
And he wants to throw himself overboard. And the only thing that prevents him is are these bonds. But I think there's a very characteristic moment in his journey home, in which even when he's resolute about returning home, he always wants to encounter things that do, let's say, push the boundary of what it is to be human. And which is a very human thing. It's not to say this is inhuman. It is a very human thing. And how do we hold ourselves back from that temptation? In this case, literally through a set of bonds. But Odysseus is, he's so okay. So I'm just trying to establish that he's defined by this. Okay, we could say this is a moment in which he's wanting something over the rainbow. He exhibits the same quality, of course, that makes Dorothy Gale of Kansas so recognizable and so iconic and archetypal for the American. And that opening song that she sings, which is maybe one of the most iconic moments in our cultural odyssey, The Wizard of Oz, is regarded by many as like one of the great, certainly one of the great musical moments in American cinema. Mm-hmm. And her singing of it, her portrayal of it, right, exhibits a kind of yearning that is extraordinarily powerful. That really defines her character, and I think defines or helps us understand what it is about that moment that appeals to us because it is such an iconically American kind of longing, something, somewhere over the rainbow. If you read the lyrics, I had to go back, I reprint them in the book. Mm-hmm. The lyrics are really quite stunning.
Yes.
It's really about some idyllic place that's just out of reach. Mm. And and then when you connect it to the Tocqueville's passage, it really comes into focus, right? The restlessness is being exhibited there by Dorothy.
And then Patrick, I know the book is a little bit different than the movie. Where does There's No Place Like Home? It seems instant. I mean, in the movie, as soon as she's finds herself standing outside of her house that's crushing the Wicked Witch of the East and the Munchkins are surrounding her and so on and so forth, there's the instant sense, I'm not where I necessarily belong. I need to find my way back. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean that she's not going to be wondrously filled with the joys of meeting a talking scarecrow or a tin man or a lion or what have you. But you see pretty quickly that somewhere over the rainbow kind of wanderlust, if you will, gets a little bit rebuffed by There's No Place Like Home. Could you say a word about that?
Yeah, and I do spend a fair amount of time in that chapter kind of discussing and comparing the book and the film.
Yeah.
The book has the film has some very interesting differences with the film. There's no moment where Dorothy wishes to be somewhere over the rainbow in the book. Mm-hmm. So she's a much more monochromatic, literally, character in the book, in L. Frank Baum's book, than she is in the movie. A quote from Salman Rushdie has a really nice short book on Wizard of Oz, which I would criticize because he ultimately he presses a kind of cosmopolitan point. He criticizes the end of the movie for being too conservative and homey and praising small town life. But he does make a couple of observations that are really worth recognizing. And one of them, he says, is that the inclusion of the song and that great moment in the movie, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, is a real improvement on the book because it gives Dorothy Gale a kind of dimension that Dorothy Gale of the book doesn't have. Yeah. That Judy Garland's portrayal of that gives a kind of depth to her character, and then you can kind of understand how the longing to leave, whether she really does or whether it's a fantasy or a dream, it's built into kind of her nature as a creature kind of creature that longs for that other place, which is the human condition. And then once she's on the path, once she's in Oz, again, I think very Odyssean, she, in spite of encountering immediately the wondrous world, it's literally over the rainbow. She does get her dream. She gets to go over the rainbow. She's literally now in a place with color in the film.
Yeah,
out of the kind of gray, flat world of Kansas. And once getting there, she begins to recognize this is not home for me. This is not somewhere I'm going to be at home. I'm encountering amazing things. I get to meet munchkins and talking scarecrows and tin men. She makes deep friendships with these companions. And the book, of course, has an even more riotous number of creatures that she encounters. But throughout it, she's pretty resolute that she wants to go home. And that's, of course, the reason for going to Oz is to be able to find that the path to home. So it is, again, it's an echo of that very Odyssean theme of encountering the radically new and different, expressing a kind of yearning to encounter that, but simultaneously longing to be in this case, to return to home, as humble as it may be. And it's interesting that Ithaca, Odysseus's home is also recognized as being a pretty humble place. It's a kind of rocky island. It's not nearly as beautiful as some of the islands that Odysseus is able to encounter on his journey home, but it's home. And that is a very recognizable human thing, that where the town I came from, where it was I grew up in, the house I grew up in, might not have been the most palatial and the nicest and the most dynamic, but it's home.
Yeah. Be it ever so humble, there's no place like home.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Patrick, in your chapter Mortal Beings in American Odyssey, you write about Odysseus' descent into Hades, saying, quote, "Let's consider what is arguably the most remarkable conversation in all of ancient literature. It occurs during Odysseus' visit to the underworld. There he encounters the spirit of Achilles, arguably the greatest of all the Greek heroes, the figure at the heart of the epic that precedes the Odyssey, which is the Iliad," close quote. Now, in this ghostly reunion with an old ally and fellow soldier, the question is raised whether Odysseus' long life striving to get home is superior or inferior to Achilles' abbreviated but heroic life fighting in war. And the shade, that is the ghost of Achilles, laments, quote, "O shining Odysseus, never try to console me for dying. I would rather follow the plow as thrall to another man, one with no land allotted him and not much to live on, than be a king over all the perished dead," close quote. This is a striking part of what you were writing, just to reflect on this. Patrick, in the end, is your sense that the homesick husband of the Odyssey, does he in a way outshine the courageous warrior of the Iliad?
Yeah, it's a stunning moment. We really have to imagine it. It's there's Odysseus. He's still alive in the underworld, encountering these spirits. He's been told by Circe he has to go to the underworld to consult with Tiresias, the soul of Tiresias, the spirit or shade of Tiresias, in order to know his way home. And then, in the course of his time down in Hades, he encounters a whole number of different shades and spirits, including his own mother, who he only learns has died by encountering her in the underworld. Very kind of moving scene. It's a really remarkable. It takes an entire book 11 of the Odyssey. But I think maybe the signature moment, the really extraordinary moment, of course, is that encounter. It's like, the hero of the preceding book and the hero of this book now get to meet and sort of assess. So how did things turn out? And essentially, what you just described is Achilles had made a decision. And we're not sure how reflected he was about that decision, how much he contemplated it. If you remember in the Iliad, he is in the tent while the war is raging on. He's been insulted by Agamemnon, who's taken his prize, the young girl he's won, Briseis, and he refuses to fight until he has some kind of recompense. And the reason is that if he's going to fight and, as is predicted, die on the field of Troy, he should at least be accorded honor and glory, that he should be esteemed. So he has a choice. He's predicted or prophesied he has a choice between a short and glorious life or a long and uneventful and forgotten life. And at least in the tent, he seems to say, look, I'm willing to do the short and glorious life, but not if I'm not going to get the glory, not if Agamemnon's going to take the kind of sign, sort of external sign of my honor.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be dishonored. And so then he seems to say, or at least suggest, okay, if that's the case, then I'll just live the long, uneventful life. I'll stay in my tent, and then when it's time to go, I'll get out of here. This is undetermined. Now he re-enters the battle after his companion Patroclus wears his armor, fights against Hector, and is killed in the battle. And at that point, Achilles is in a white-hot fury. He is absolutely driven by just intense desire to slaughter Hector. And he says even when he kills him, to take his heart out of his body and to consume it. He, of course, famously, when he kills Hector, he drags his body 3 times around the city of Troy. It's not just to kill him, but to humiliate him in the view of his parents and his family and his countrymen. It's not enough just to slay the person who killed his friend, but to absolutely humiliate him, to refuse to bury him. And all of these things are just contrary to basic, of course, human decency, but the Greek customs of burial and honoring the dead were being completely abrogated here by Achilles. So here now, Odysseus, in 10 years later, 10 plus some years, maybe 10, after the Trojan War, is in the underworld, maybe not quite 10 years, but some years afterwards, is in the underworld and encounters Achilles, who now, he says to him, look, you're being honored. You are regarded, everyone is singing your praises. You have become immortal in the words of people above the ground. He tells him, you got your desire. You lived a short life, but it was a glorious life. And now people will talk about you forever. And what is Achilles' answer to that? It's the lines you just read. He says, don't try to flatter me. Yeah. I would rather be a slave and still alive than the king of the underworld, than regarded as this great heroic figure. And so in that moment, it's as if Homer of the Odyssey is basically saying to Homer of the Iliad, Achilles actually wasn't much of a hero. What the choice that he made was not made in a kind of conscious awareness that the short, glorious life was really what he wanted. He did it out of anger, right? The first word of the Iliad is sing muse of the anger of Achilles. He did it out of anger and a kind of snap decision that wasn't reflected upon. And here, what I really want to do in this chapter is to contrast this with Odysseus, who you could say he's given a kind of a better deal because it looks like he's going to get a fairly longer life and glory. So he gets kind of both. But in the end of the day, he has a choice to make whether he could have not just a long, uneventful life, but a potentially immortal life, that he doesn't have to go to the underworld because he's offered immortality by Calypso. And this is, of course, the key moment in the book. This is 7 years that Odysseus, of the 10 years Odysseus is returning home, 7 of them are spent on the island of Calypso. So a lot of the journey is kind of nothing's happening. Fortunately, we don't have to spend every day. They don't describe every day. But it's basically him sleeping with this goddess. He said, at least at some point he was happy to do it. A beautiful young woman who is immortal and wants to have him there. And it's a beautiful island. It's described in this very lush, gorgeous prose, or I should say poetry, lush language. And he at some point, maybe from very early on, but decides I can't stay here. I need to get out of here. I need to go home. And so the first time we see Odysseus, which is in the very opening pages of book 5, so it takes us 4 books to get there. The very opening pages of book 5 begins in medias res, in the middle of things, with Odysseus now in year 10, 7 of which have been on Calypso's island, weeping on the shore of Calypso's island, longing to see the smoke emitting from the chimney of his home to return home. That the offer of immortality by this goddess, he has had now 7 years to think about it. And we will discover later, has already been to the underworld. He's heard Achilles say that he would rather be a slave. And in spite of this, Odysseus has decided, and it's not a momentary, quick, off-the-cuff decision. It's a long-considered decision that he will accept his mortal condition, that he will leave the island of Calypso. He will turn down the offer of immortality in order to return to Penelope and Telemachus and Ithaca. And to my mind, this is maybe this is the deepest lesson of the Odyssey, and maybe the establishment of the Western civilization in some senses, which is that we're defined, to be a human is to be defined by our commitments to others, to those that we love. What was the gospel reading last week, right? He who dies for his friends.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Is the greatest love of all, right?
Yes.
That Odysseus is essentially saying, I could live forever with this lovely goddess, but I want to go home. Even though I know I will end up back in Hades in some amount of time. But as a human, my fundamental, what I am, my condition, is reflected in the commitments I have to those that I love, and where home is. So this is, to me, the most profound lesson of the Odyssey.
That is so good. And you know, when I reread the Odyssey about 2 years ago, I was stunned once again with how lyrical it was. It was gorgeous. I just was so struck by how beautiful it was. But the other thing is, it's unexpected in the sense that an ancient work of literature could have someone like Achilles. Like, you'd think, you know what? They're the originators of this kind of demigod hero that everybody idolizes, and it's all awesome. And in fact, he's got regrets. He says it wasn't necessarily all worth it. One could say at the very origins, the story would be that Odysseus stays with Calypso and says, this is where it's at. Or the crew says, let's hang with the Lotus Eaters, like being in the parents' basement, playing video games and smoking pot for the rest of your life. This is where we're going to be. We're going to eat Fritos and be happy. And it's pleasure and all this stuff. And yet, like you said, Odysseus drags them off and says, we need to go. It's unexpected. And yet when you analyze it, kind of viscerally, you think about it and you feel with them, you say, that seems true. What Achilles is saying to Odysseus, what Odysseus is saying to Calypso, what Odysseus is saying to the guys that want to just stay and loll around and so on. I want to go in spite of the trials and the tribulations and the suffering, because there is this thing at the end that even though it won't be perfect, it calls me, it beckons me, my commitments reside there. That is so nuanced, and yet it is so comporting, I think, with what it means to be human, that I am stunned that this came from 2,500 years ago.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, I think there are modern day stories that try to tell us that human nature is not that way, and it falls flat because you're like, that's not the way it is. That's not the way a person thinks. That's a deformation that you're trying to say this. We've apprehended human nature in this way it is, and in fact, it isn't. And we all many of us feel somewhat uncomfortable with the premise. And yet here we are, 2,500 years ago, and this sort of the watching Foyle's War, and there's the cock of the eyebrow. One of my friends says, look at Detective Superintendent Christopher Foyle. He says less lines, but everything is said by a cock of an eyebrow, a bite of the lower lip. There's tons of eyebrow cocking and lower lip biting in Homer's Odyssey that just rings true. I'm not trying to be too effusive, but I'm just stunned by it.
Yeah. No, it's and it's such a masterful literary piece of work, because this description of what is happening in book 5, first of all, it's I won't spend much time on this, but first of all, it's preceded by a one line that describes the dawn rising. So it's lyrically introducing a new day, which is always dawn rose and spread her rosy fingers. If the Odyssey, almost every book begins with dawn rising and spreading her rosy fingers.
Yeah.
But book 5 begins with a different version of this line. And so and it's the only time that the poet does this. And it's that dawn rose from the side of haughty Tithonus. And you have to know some Greek mythology to know what's up here. Tithonus, for listeners who know some mythology or those who don't, Tithonus was a human being that Dawn, the goddess Dawn, falls in love with. And so she says, hey, Tithonus, why don't you kind of bed down with me and I'll make you immortal? And he says, sure. So she goes to Zeus and says, I've fallen in love with this mortal and I'd like you to make him immortal, that he never dies. And Zeus says, yes, your wish is granted and everything's great. And so it's in the midst of this that she rises from the side of haughty Tithonus. Why is he haughty? Because he's a human who became immortal. But Dawn forgot to ask for eternal youth. And so haughty Tithonus is now on a glide path to just infinite and eternal aging, to the point in which he shrivels to the size of a grasshopper. And this is sort of the Greek mythological version of where grasshoppers come from, is they're all the brood of Tithonus. So it's a wonderful moment in which basically the poet is signaling, look, this temptation of the goddess is one that human beings rarely, if ever, turn down. Yeah. It is almost unthinkable for a human being, certainly at the time of the Greeks, in which there's no really nice heaven to go to. You get to go to Hades. Even Achilles goes to Hades. Hades is really quite awful. So there's nothing to be wished for in terms of the afterlife. So why wouldn't you accept eternal life if it's offered to you? So I think that just that one line, again, if you glide over it too quickly, you miss it. What it's really indicating is that, look, Odysseus is doing something that basically no mortal man typically will do. And I think when you're contrasting the forms of heroism that you see in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I love both the works, but I do love the Odyssey more. And I love the Odyssey more because I do think the Odyssey articulates a form of heroism, in particularly in this moment, in which you can recognize this is a kind of heroism that doesn't rely on brute force. It's not Achilles being stronger than Hector. It's not a kind of aristocratic kind of heroism. It's a heroism of every man. It's a heroism that every human being is capable of. Not everyone can be an Achilles, but every human being can recognize that I am a mortal being and my mortality is in some ways tied to my commitment to other human beings, and therefore that my loves are that which define me and not simply my love of myself. Again, a very proto-Christian story. And again, I think there's you could say the ground was being prepared already in the West in this particular episode.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3. Ordinary people and the ambivalence of being at home. In American Odyssey, Patrick Deneen recalls the story of Elpenor, a recently deceased lowly crewmate whom Odysseus encountered in Hades. His body still unburied and unmourned, the shade of Elpenor asks Odysseus to honor him with a proper burial. Quote, "For the first time in the Iliad and the Odyssey," Deneen writes, "a nobody becomes a somebody, a person whose life matters and over whose death other men mourn," close quote. So Patrick, this was a very moving part of the Odyssey, but especially the way you framed it in your chapter, Ordinary People. Could you just tell us the fuller story and import of the ghostly encounter with the common man, Elpenor?
Yeah. So we only know a few names of Odysseus's shipmates, and they are the kind of, second in command. Right? They're often sort of slightly rebelling against Odysseus. There's a possibility of mutiny at various points. They disagree with what Odysseus is telling them to do. But it's quite telling that those people who get a name, typically in the Homeric world, are the people of importance, the people of rank. Right? This is a kind of aristocratic society. It doesn't dwell until we get to the latter part of the Odyssey. It doesn't dwell on ordinary people typically. Even in the Iliad, Odysseus is quite disdainful toward someone who isn't at the same rank of Agamemnon. Yeah. There's a scene in Book 2 of the Iliad where Odysseus kind of quite forcefully puts down someone who he sees as a kind of common or ordinary person. So there's a very kind of different portrayal of Odysseus. But right at the end of Book 10, they're on Circe's island, and Circe again has told them, "Well, your next trip is to go to the underworld. This is your next," and this is horrible. All the men are lamenting and they're tearing their hair out, and how horrible. But the night before, we learn the name of one of the shipmates, who's not anyone of any particular nobility. In fact, he's described as kind of the least among the soldiers. He's not a particularly noteworthy soldier. He's kind of a lousy soldier. He's kind of like Klinger of MASH, if you know the reference. He's this kind of guy who's just not very good. And he drinks too much. I guess it's a warm day. as it can be in Greece, and he goes up on the roof to get some cool air, and he's drunk, he falls asleep, and in the middle of the night, he rolls off the roof and falls and breaks his neck, and his soul descends to the underworld. And he's so unimportant that when the men the next morning leave for the underworld, no one notices that Elpenor's not on the ship. He's completely unnoticed. That's like he's Kevin from Home Alone. He's like, just don't even notice that guy's missing. And it's when Odysseus gets to the underworld, starting in book 11, he's the first soul that Odysseus meets. Because he's not buried yet. So in a sense, his soul is still kind of on the edge or the borders. He's on the mantle of the door of Hades. And Odysseus laments that he's there. He said, "What happened, Elpenor?" And what Elpenor describes. And then he asks a favor of Odysseus. He says, "When you return to Circe's island, will you bury me? Will you pay me honors? And above my grave, will you put the oar that I used when I rowed?" Right? This is not a great war. He's not asking for the sword or the shield. He says, "Put the oar. I was an oarsman. Put the oar above my grave." And Odysseus promises that he'll do this. And then at the start of book 12, when they get back to Circe's island, it's described that he does this, that his men bury the body of Elpenor, who they didn't even realize had been dead. And they bury him, and it's made in a very poignant way. They bury him out in a kind of point of Circe's island, so so that when passing ships sail by, they will see this grave and they will know here lies the body of a sailor. That this man who was almost kind of unrecognized and unacknowledged in life will now be recognized in death. And it's I think it marks a kind of turning point in the not just the Odyssey, but in the whole of what we know of the Homeric poems, because we're now shifting, or we're beginning the shift to a world in which the lives of ordinary people are going to matter. Yeah. And they're going to matter in very profound and significant ways, especially when we get back to Ithaca. That Ithaca is being torn asunder by the divisions within, especially the nobility, the suitors, who are the children of the highborn, are in a kind of division with Odysseus's house, and there's a potential for a kind of civil war once Odysseus returns. But the people who are really suffering through all of this are the ordinary people. Mm-hmm. It's the swineherd and the cattle herder and the servant woman who will play a prominent role, who helped raise Odysseus. These become very prominent figures in the latter part of the Odyssey. You could say that who becomes a hero now suddenly shifts from the kind of Achillean character to a swineherd, which is it's a really remarkable shift. And I think Elpenor's descent to Hades is, in a way, it's a signal that, look, the things that make us really distinctive and different in life, supposedly, our birth, origin of our nobility according to our birthplace and so forth, these don't really matter when we're dead. We're all going to die. And so there's a kind of the beginnings of a recognition of some kind of common humanity in the recognition of Odysseus, of Elpenor, both in the underworld and then in his burial.
Patrick, is there a sense, I know this is conjecture, but is there a sense in your mind that part of the popularity of a story or an epic like the Odyssey is that people listening to it back in its day finally heard about themselves being heroes in an epic? I mean, it must have been somewhat contrary to most storytelling, which is about gods and heroes and warriors and so on, that you have a noble swineherd. You have a faithful, stay-at-home wife, Penelope, that ends up being quietly but iconically heroic in a way that's runs against conventions. Again, I'm just curious, from your reading of the great literature of that day, did that particular distinction, was that a particular distinction that many others had not been doing? Or would you say, honestly, Todd, the common man has been a hero, common woman has been a hero in a lot of these old stories? We're just not necessarily seeing it quite as much as we should.
No, I think, again, we don't have all of the epics. We only have a few of them from, obviously, so it's hard to say. But an awful lot of I'm just kind of running through my mind. Certainly, the great the tragedies of Athens, for the most part, featured the kind of great people. Oedipus is a king, and Clytemnestra, Agamemnon, Orestes are in a royal house. Often the dramas would focus on the highborn. Now, of course, the comedies. The comedies would focus on ordinary people, but these precisely because it was, these were people you would laugh at and were kind of ridiculous in some ways. So I think that it's reflective of something. Why I think the Odyssey reflects the work of some kind of great genius who we call Homer and might have been named Homer. That, like so many really great works of literature, the philosophic teaching is made palatable and accessible through a great kind of storytelling. In other words, I think I wrote this many years ago that if you want to find political philosophy or philosophy in America, you probably are best off looking in our literature. We do have philosophers. We've got John Dewey, and John Rawls, but we're a democracy, and so not every individual citizen is going to want to go off and read John Dewey or John Rawls. The Johns. But at least historically, we've been a people that have really appreciated and embraced American literature. And American literature that succeeds tends to be wants to entertain. It will succeed by entertaining. And again, one of the work that I talk about in relationship to this discussion of mortal beings, I know we're talking about ordinary people now, but referring to the last segment, is Huckleberry Finn, which is a very Odyssean work. In fact, a lot of people who've read Huckleberry Finn from very early on began comparing it to the Odyssey and thinking this has a lot of the same themes. It's got a character that's a lot like Odysseus. Huck is kind of a trickster, and he's constantly assuming disguises, and he's goes on a whole set of adventures over, across water, and he's very Odyssean in lots of ways. And so the story captures us, and many of us can, if we read Huckleberry Finn, we can remember different episodes. And which episode did you like the best? Was it the Duke and the Dauphin? Was it the Grangerford, the feud? Was it the so many of these wonderful picaresque moments in this journey home. I'm sorry, in this journey down the Mississippi. But in some ways, the philosophical teaching of Huck is really the relationship of Huck and Jim. And what begins as a relationship between basically Huck is kind of an outsider in his society and Jim is an escaped slave becomes a very deep friendship and a profound friendship. One of the great portrayals of friendship in literature. And of course, a friendship that's not supposed to happen, a white boy and an escaped black slave. And the really key scene that I talk about in the book, of course, famously, is when Huck is thinking, his conscience is getting the better of him, and he's thinking, I really need to write to Miss Watson, who's the owner of Jim, and tell her that, I have your escaped slave Jim, and we're down in this town. And he writes the letter thinking this will ensure that I'll go to heaven. So I get to be immortal, you could say. I get to have a good immortality. And I'll send this letter to Miss Watson. And then he's looking at the letter and he begins thinking about all the times he and Jim were on the boat together. And he begins thinking about the episodes and how Jim cared for him and called him honey and would take his watch and would let Huck sleep. And he looks at that letter and he says, I'm in a close place. And he says, I know I'm not supposed to do this, but he tears up the letter and he says, all right, then I'll go to hell for his friend. And, this is, again, just stunningly, again, given the influence of the Odyssey and how I've thought about the world, this to me is like the ultimate Odyssean moment that when it comes to a choice between supposedly a nice immortality and a terrible death in Hades, because of his friendship to Jim, he chooses what he thinks is going to be his terrible fate in hell, believing this, not feigning this, but believing that he's going to end up, in a sense, in Hades because of his friendship with Jim. And I also mentioned in that chapter that one of the few real genuine scholarly discoveries that I can brag about, which political theorists rarely actually have, is that I found an unpublished burlesque book review that Twain wrote about the Odyssey, which he composed around the time he was finishing Huck Finn. So he was thinking about the Odyssey. We have kind of a smoking gun that he was thinking about the Odyssey as he was finishing writing the book Huck Finn. So he himself had the Odyssey on the mind as he was writing this great portrayal of human friendship and the choice to go to hell.
Wonderful. Patrick, from Nicholas, is it Kazantzakis?
Kazantzakis, yes.
Kazantzakis, yes. I'll leave it to your good pronunciation. From his poetic The Odyssey, a modern sequel, to Alfred Lord Tennyson's Ulysses, which Ulysses is a Roman name for Odysseus, to Dante's Ulysses in the Inferno, the post-adventure life of Odysseus is one of tension between, as you write, two possible poles. What was when the Odyssey ends, does Odysseus bathe in homecoming, or is he off on adventure? Does he pursue human fame or godly immortality? Does he pursue solidarity or solitude? Respecting the words of the blind prophet Tiresias, which kind of has the notion of going inland and carrying an oar, which everybody won't even understand what that is because they don't know bodies of water. They're going to think it's a winnowing fan and so on. How do you think the Odyssey truly ends?
So this was actually in some ways the topic of my dissertation, which was on the Odyssey and the afterlife of the Odyssey in the tradition of political theory. And almost as soon as the Odyssey is at least sort of known, committed to paper or papyrus or whatever, that's sheepskin, you almost instantly get sequels written. And a lot of those sequels consist in a couple of different forms. A lot of them disbelieve that Odysseus would be happy at home. So very early on, like the poet Lucian writes a sequel, or at least writes a kind of set of passages in which Odysseus is writing letters to Calypso saying, I really regret having left you and I'd like to come back to your island. So that big portentous choice he makes in book 5 turns out, like Achilles, he regrets it. He just wants to go back and live with the beautiful goddess. I come home, I kind of clean house, and now it's boring, and I want to go back.
I think he would die in his bathtub like Agamemnon if that happened.
But but I think it reflects the fact that from the very first moment that people are reading the Odyssey, you get to the end of it, and your first thought is, what's next? This great adventure, this great, incredible journey that he takes, and then reestablishing order in his home. And not to be a spoiler, but the gods now kind of Deus ex machina, basically just saying, okay, that's it. No more vengeance. This is all done. The war is over. No one's allowed to kill each other anymore, avenging whomever's son. This is, and the gods, it turns out all along, the gods would have had the ability to do this. So they could have even prevented the Trojan War, but they didn't. Mm-hmm. So they let this whole thing play out. And then at the very end of the Odyssey, it's essentially saying, okay, now the Trojan War is finally done. But it takes a kind of intervention of the gods to do it, like at the end of the Oresteia, for example. And then immediately, I think the reader's mind goes to, so what's next? And we have from Tiresias this prediction that Odysseus will have to go out again. So we know he's going to have to leave. And it's suggested he'll go to a place far inland. He basically has to appease Poseidon, whose anger he's provoked. And the way of appeasing him is to introduce the idea of the ocean, or to introduce the notion of what the ocean is, to a people that will not know what an oar is. That's what you were alluding to. They'll look at an oar and they'll say, that's a fan that sort of a slave holds over Cleopatra. They'll mistake an oar because they won't know what it's for. And at that point, he's to plant the oar, and this is an echo to Elpenor, I think. He's to plant the oar and say, there is a god that you don't know of, and he's named Poseidon, and he rules a sea so vast you can't even imagine it. And so it's kind of proselytizing on behalf of Poseidon, and this will assuage his anger. He'll get new sacrifices, and he'll let Odysseus live in peace. But we've already it's already been suggested to us that Odysseus will leave home again, and many subsequent readers of the Odyssey then conclude, well, he would leave. He wouldn't. This is a guy who now has caught the bug. He will not be content staying at home with his aging wife and his son, who wants eventually to become king, and he'll find a way to leave again. So a lot of the tradition is basically Odysseus leaving, particularly because he's that figure who wants to know. He wants to encounter the unknown and the yet unseen. And among the most famous, justly famous of these portrayals is Dante in the Inferno, in which Odysseus is in the 8th circle of hell. So he's quite low, quite close to the center of hell. And from the flames, he tells the story to Dante and to Virgil of his final demise, when he persuades men of Ithaca to once again go out to sea, that they can't simply live in Ithaca without exploring anew. And he persuades them to go, and they sail past the Rock of Gibraltar, the Pillars of Hercules. So they're now moving, to the west, into the sea where one didn't go generally, certainly with the ships that they had, and discovers a mountain eventually, which it suggested this might be the base of Purgatorio and Paradiso, that he encounters this mountain and they attempt to ascend it, and one is not allowed to ascend to the mountain, ultimately the Paradiso, through a kind of back entrance. So at that point, the divine retribution god destroys their ship and they're sunk. And then Achilles said, and then all was lost, and here I find myself. So Dante portrays, by the Roman word Ulysses, as this figure who is not only unable to stay home, but unable to simply be content with his sort of mortal condition, and wants to discover, right, the truths that at this point a pre-Christian society is not quite yet ready to receive, and does so in a kind of imperative and presumptive way, and therefore is destroyed. So he's a creature of kind of hubris, as portrayed in Dante. So I think that Dantean portrayal is reflective of a lot of subsequent interpretations of the Odyssey, in which Odysseus is really not the figure of nostos and homecoming, but he's the figure of algos, of the longing for something that's absent, and that which is absent has to be found off island, has to be found by sailing again out to sea.
So I'm reading this, and I'm like, to my own personal desires, I want Odysseus to be content at home, that he's done his, he went off to war, like you said, somewhat reluctantly. He fought all that time, and then he struggles. And this sensitivity of Odysseus, I feel like throughout, especially when he becomes very emotional, when Demodocus, the blind minstrel, is singing the songs, and they discover who Odysseus is, and they're singing the songs of the Trojan War and the losses of the heroes and so on and so forth. Odysseus to me seems, I don't know, to my way of thinking, I know he's not perfect, but he kind of seemed to finally have his heart in the right place. And it's heartbreaking to me to think he goes home and then he says, well, I don't know, guys, I've been puttering in the garage. I'm kind of bored. And I feel like I'm in the way. No one wants me to cook it all. And then I'm going to go off. And Telemachus has been looking for me, and my wife's been looming and re-looming forever for me to come back. It seems like, I'm like, I felt like he was just this wonderful guy with a mix of homesickness and restlessness all together, but that he ends up being kind of a jackass if he goes away in the end. So is it wrong for me to want him to come home and have a contentment that transcends the desire for knowing and so on, or am I just not Greek enough?
Well, I think this is really one of the wonderful things about the Odyssey, is that it ends on this kind of ambivalent note, and I think that note it's the ambivalence of being human, and again, it's an ambivalence that I think is especially keenly felt among Americans. That it's go back to that passage by Tocqueville with which we began. As soon as they put before they put the roof on their house, they sell it and they go somewhere else. That we're home seekers and homemakers, but we're also pioneers and explorers and astronauts and pilgrims. And we're both of those things at once. And so I think we can recognize in the conclusion of the Odyssey, both possibilities are really live. And you were asking me earlier about the Wizard of Oz and Dorothy. Well, Salman Rushdie reads or sees the Wizard of Oz, and in his book he writes, he despises the conclusion of the Wizard of Oz because he doesn't believe for a moment that someone like Dorothy, who's sang that song about somewhere over the rainbow and who encountered Oz, would ever want to stay in that horrible, dingy little place in Kansas. That he thinks it's just completely false, kind of sentimental, maudlin conclusion to what really should have been a great story of bursting out into the world, a kind of, I am now shaking off the dust of this town and going to explore the bright lights, big city. But I think that conclusion, I can understand why he would think that, but it dispels this tension that I think itself is embodied in the Wizard of Oz, is embodied in the Odyssey. And I think we can all have what might be our preference. Katsansakis wrote this massive sequel, right? The Odyssey, a modern sequel, it's called, longer than the original, in which is all about him leaving Ithaca very shortly after he gets back because he realizes or he recognizes this is not where he can spend the rest of his life. And his object becomes kind of achieving a kind of human freedom. So the modern Odyssey, as told by Katsansakis, is about the achievement of a kind of radical human freedom in which wandering becomes, he actually has a line which is to be the wanderer is to be at home. That is what my home is, right? To be no place is to be what I really am, is to be where I belong. I think, to, I guess, put in a word for the ambivalence, I share with you, and I actually conclude the book by saying, I think as human beings, we're always in this tension between the desire for more, for over the rainbow, and the desire for home. And we, in some ways, always have to read the signs of the time to understand maybe where we have to sail closer to between the Scylla of homecoming and the Charybdis of being homeless or being at sea. And there can be times when you're too much at home, when you're too incurious, when you're too sedentary, you're too much of a lotus eater. And there can be times when you're too adrift and too rootless. And where are we now? Where are we individually, of course, is an answer only one can answer for oneself. But I think as a broader society, this is my effort to do a little bit of political theorizing at the end of the book. I think it's very hard for modern Americans to feel at home. I think we've become more homeless over time. The tension in what it is to be an American has tilted in one direction. I mean, it's hard for our younger generation to have a home. They are not getting married. They're not making families. We are, even when we're in a home, we're on a screen much of the time. We're elsewhere. We're in that lotus eater experience, even oddly enough, at home. So I think in a way you could say that the Odyssey offers to us a portrayal of this tension and an invitation to reflect on the truth of both of these aspects of Odysseus, and to recognize that to deny one of these aspects is to deny something really fundamentally human, but not to submit to one at the expense of the other.
Two final questions for you, Patrick. In 1911, the Greek poet Constantine Cavafy, I believe I'm pronouncing his last name right, wrote the poem Ithaca. Obviously, we've been talking about Ithaca. This is the home of Odysseus that he's trying to get to throughout this entire epic. This poem is extraordinary. I had never read it before. And it opens, as you set out for Ithaca, hope the voyage is a long one, full of adventure, full of discovery. And it goes on, and then it ends, keep Ithaca always in your mind. Arriving there is what you are destined for, but do not hurry the journey at all. Better if it lasts for years, so you are old by the time you reach the island, wealthy with all you have gained on the way, not expecting Ithaca to make you rich. Ithaca gave you the marvelous journey. Without her, you would not have set out. She has nothing left to give you now. And if you find her poor, Ithaca won't have fooled you. Wise as you will have become, so full of experience, you will have understood by then what these Ithacas mean. So, Patrick, what should Ithaca mean to you and me?
Yeah, I'm always moved by that poem. It's profound and it's beautiful. And I think in some ways, it's sadly true. I mean, I began by talking about reading the Odyssey in my hometown of Windsor, Connecticut, which I dearly love and very grateful for. And when I go back there, I have something of that Cavafy experience of no longer quite seeing the town I grew up in. And all of us, I think, probably of a certain age, when we go back to whatever the origin point was. Of course, it's not the same. It's the people have moved away or passed away, or it's been fundamentally reconstructed, or buildings may be dilapidated and stores have been closed, and things don't remain the same. And so, and then there's the deeper part of that poem, which is that it's not just that you can't go home again because home will have changed, but you will have changed. Mm-hmm. You will have, so much you will have experienced. And Odysseus is just his version of all of us, that when you go forth into the world, go off to college, get your jobs, have a family, experience life, home won't, whatever that home was, won't be the same, because you will have been so changed by those experiences. And so it's simultaneously a recognition that, it talks about home being poorer, that in your mind, it might still be that rich place, the place of youthful experience and wonder. And in reality, it's probably poorer, not just because it may be literally poor, but because you bring so much more wealth in terms of your own experience to it. But it's also that you couldn't have become that person without it. Yeah. And so it's simultaneously to recognize its limitations, but also I find it beautiful and poignant to evoke a sense of gratitude, even in its diminishment, whatever that might be, that you couldn't have become that person. You couldn't have had that journey without that point of origin. So I have this experience. I'm actually always in a deep, profound sense of nostalgia when I go home. I drive around the old streets and look at the old houses, and I notice, and it kind of pains me. I feel really genuinely this kind of physical heartache when I see how much has changed, and houses of friends that maybe look a little dilapidated, and go past the graves of my grandparents, and I feel this deep sense of exactly what Cavafy is describing there, of this is not the same place, and yet I couldn't be who I am without it. And so I and this is why I try to describe it in the book. Just imagine what it is for Odysseus to be home. And I think both of us would like to think, okay, this guy finally gets some rest. Finally spend some time with Penelope and get to know his son, and enjoy kind of a more sedentary life. And at the same time, I think probably all of us suspect, he's probably going to get some wanderlust before long. Yeah. And that's right. I think we shouldn't deny that both of those things can be possibilities, and not to deny the tension as well.
Patrick, you've been unbelievably generous with your time. One last question for you. How have you personally been changed by reading and writing about the Odyssey?
Hasn't that been our whole conversation?
Yeah, I guess it has, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it set into motion, really. I never expected, as a young kid, young man, to be, you described me, the college professor at Notre Dame. I have no academic connections in my life before having gone off to college. Nobody in my family was in academia. I didn't even know how one became a college professor. I had a professor, late great Kerry McWilliams, who in my junior year said, I said, I think I'll go to law school. And he said, well, you're not going to law school. You're going to go to graduate school. And I said, what's that? I had no idea what's graduate school. And he said, well, you'll just become a professor. I said, I thought professors were just like grown like mushrooms or something. So I didn't have no real understanding of this. But when he put the idea in my head, I was like, that's really, I'd like to do this. I'd like to stay in college. And then so much of my scholarly life, for those who may only know me from Weiler, Bosom Failed, or perhaps from some other work, but so much of my work has really been focused on these themes we've been talking about. which is particularly in the setting of modern America, and we could say more broadly within the liberal, political, cultural, economic order, it's so deeply defined by a kind of restlessness and being in motion and the pursuit of happiness. And it is deeply, profoundly a part of our American self-understanding. And we haven't mentioned this yet, but of course the book is written, it's called The American Odyssey, but I wrote it not just because the film was coming out tomorrow for me, but also because the film is being released the same month that we celebrated the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
And part of my reason for writing it was, of course, I finished it before the July 4th celebrations, but leading up to it, so much of the conversation about the Declaration was emphasizing how the Declaration sets forth the principles of liberty, of human freedom, of our independence, right? Think of that word, independence. Mm-hmm. We are self-standing. We're like the gods. We're creatures that are self-sufficient in some ways. We can be independent. We can be free. We have liberty. And I knew this was going to be I really anticipated correctly that this would be such a profound, overwhelming part of the discourse around the July 4th celebration. I thought partly what I wanted to do in this book was to remind readers that while all that's true, a deep and profound part of the American experience is also the desire for home. Those who came to America and wanted independence, they wanted independence from Britain so that they could be self-governing, so they could be those figures that Tocqueville describes in the New England townships. In other words, that they could make homes and build communities and be self-governing. And this required then all of those virtues that we've been discussing that at least from time to time, Odysseus manifests, that finding that middle course between the beasts and the gods, being committed to one's home and to one's people, accepting the limitations of our human condition, including our mortality as part of that, the emphasis upon ordinary people and their virtues, what they can contribute to society, all while recognizing that the desire for freedom is built into our psyche, but not to forget or diminish what I would say is also a very deeply constitutive part of our character, and which can trace its roots all the way back to what we've been talking about in the Odyssey. So hopefully this book can act as a little bit of a kind of balance to what has been, I think, the more dominant discourse around the celebration of our 250th birthday.
Patrick J. Deneen, professor, author, and modern-day Odyssean. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Todd, it's been great. Thank you for having me.
So I've been thinking. When I first read Homer's Odyssey, I was struck by its exquisite beauty. How could something so old be so incredibly lyrical? And yet, even so, the lilting eloquence of the work wasn't even the primary virtue of this timeless epic. Instead, it was the story of a man simply trying to find his way home. To fully understand the majesty of the Odyssey, one first has to read its predecessor, the Iliad. The Iliad showcases a 10-year war of violence and pestilence, hunger and hardship between armies painfully removed from home or armies assaulted at home. Immortalized names such as Agamemnon and Achilles, Hector and Paris, Patroclus and Odysseus populate this tale, and with so much loss, the Iliad grinds you down bit by bloody bit. It's no wonder Odysseus was tragically homesick. And so he embarks on an adventure. But it is an unsought adventure. Gone is the Greek sense of vaulted experience and timeless honor. Instead, we just have a weary man who misses his wife, longs for his son, and hungers for hearth and home. I've never been to war, and hope I never will, but I have been homesick. Odysseus is you, and Odysseus is me. One of the most compelling lessons I learned from Patrick Deneen's American Odyssey is a temptation to jettison our humanity in the name of the secure. And what is the secure? It is the desire for self-sufficiency, the aspiration toward immediate knowledge, and the arrival at comfortable obliviousness. Who wouldn't want to be rid of frustrating dependency, galling uncertainty, and ineradicable angst. The gods and the beasts are free. Why aren't we? We do well to avoid these temptations because they would make us inhuman. They would deform. They would blunt the drive for something greater, God and family. The thorns in our sides that force us to rely on one another, live in wonder, and fundamentally give a damn are thorns that cultivate a dependence on God and a love for our brethren. If Odysseus caved in to the less than or more than human, he would never have arrived home. The Odyssey is a gorgeous epic, but it is an even better reminder that the human condition we curse is also the human condition that brings us home. And one last thing, read Patrick Deneen's American Odyssey, but also go back and read the original Odyssey. Whether it is Robert Fagel's, Emily Wilson's, or Robert Fitzgerald's translations, you can't go wrong with a swirling epic that is hungry for home. As Homer writes, quote, "Sing to me of the man, muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy," close quote. It is the story of Odysseus, but it is also the story of you and me. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.